Before we continue over to the next section though, I do want to show you one more thing that we can do with custom renderers. That is actually going to be quite useful for us to make our Android app look a bit closer to what we see on iOS. So right now on our iOS application, if you were to select one of the categories, and this would happen of course in any list view that you have, you will see that the selected cell turns gray. Its background turns gray. However, when it comes to the Android application, we have this awful orange background that doesn't go at all with our application. So what I'm going to show you throughout this lecture is how to change this color. And let me tell you, it's not going to be as straightforward as you may think, because this background color cannot be found anywhere. So the only way in which I have come up with a solution is to actually continue using custom renderers. So of course, and let me just open that page back again, we know that in the categories page we have this list view that is displaying view cells. Now, so far in our custom renderers, we only have a text cell renderer. We do not have a view cell renderer yet. So what I will do is actually implement this functionality only for the view cell, but of course the same would apply to the text cell, to the image cell, to the switch cell, to any type of cell that you may require. So let's go ahead and get started. Basically what we want is to change the background over on Android to a gray, or maybe we can even implement something similar to what we just did and pass some value through a property, maybe the same style ID, so the background is different depending on the value. But basically what we have to do, of course, is go ahead and create our new custom renderer. So let's just go ahead and create over on an Android project a new class. This is going to be a new custom renderer, which is going to be for view cells. So I am going to call custom view cell renderer. And again, something very similar is going to happen if you want this to be implemented in text cells, in image cells, switch cells, etc. Of course, the first thing that we have to do is make this class inherit from view cell renderer. And view cell renderer is over on Xamarin Forms Platform Android. And so now this is a view cell renderer. Of course, we still have to export this. So over here, you may remember how the export can happen from wherever you want. So let's just export it from the exact same file that we exported this custom text cell renderer. So let me just go ahead and copy this line of code, and I will be exporting for view cells the custom view cell renderer. So simply exporting this as we have done before. Again, it doesn't matter from where we're exporting it. In fact, we could be exporting everything from the exact same place. It's just, I feel, a little bit more organized. So it doesn't matter from where you're exporting it, as long as you are doing so. So what we're going to need inside of this new custom renderer is a couple of new things that I'm going to be setting here as global variables. These are going to remain private, so we're only going to be using them from within this class. And what I will do is define an android.views.view, which is going to be the actual cell. And this will be clear in just a second why I need the cell from here, but let me just go ahead and define another variable in here, which is going to be private bool, and this is going to be is selected. In fact, let me go ahead and define a third variable in here, a private drawable. And to be able to use drawable, we will need a using directive to Android graphics drawables. And this is going to be the default background. So what I mean by defining these three variables is that from the beginning, there is a default background for the cells. Eventually, I want to change the background of the selected cell, but if the cell is no longer selected, I want it back to the default background. So that default background is going to be in here. Deselected, I guess it's self-described, is simply going to hold if a certain cell is selected. And the cell, well, is going to be the current cell that is being selected. And the reason why I need this is because I will be using it from outside of the method that we have used before, which is, if you may remember, the getCellCore method. So here we are getting a cell core. Let me go ahead and use my cell variable, my new cell variable, and assign it to whatever this method is returning. Eventually, this is still going to be returning that cell. So let me just go ahead and return that cell. But meanwhile, I already have this value in the cell variable as well. Also, I'm going to set by default isSelected to be false. So by default, this cell that I'm getting from here is not selected. And I will also set the default background to be whatever we have in the cell's background variable. So right from the beginning, our variables have some value by default. Of course, the getCellCore is still doing its thing, but we now have these values available from outside of it. And the reason why I need them outside of it is because we're also going to be overriding the onPropertyChanged method. And you may have guessed it, here we will be able to evaluate if the property that changed is the isSelected property. And if it is, we are going to change isSelected to true. So let's actually go ahead and do that. It turns out that this method, of course, is going to be called every single time any property from the cell changes. So we have to make sure that the property that actually changed is, well, the isSelected. So you notice how we are receiving some event arguments in here with the property name. So all we have to do is evaluate if the property name is the isSelected property. And if it is, well, isSelected is going to change to its opposite. So if isSelected was false, it should now be true. And if it was true, it should now be false. So I'm simply going to deny the previous value of isSelected. Hopefully this is not too complicated to understand. We're going to have an isSelected variable set to false at the beginning. And every time the isSelected property for a particular cell changes, well, we are going to negate the current value. Remember that this view cell renderer is going to be created once for every single cell that we have over on the list view. And every single cell is going to be calling the property changed method every single time any of their property changes. And if the property that changed is the isSelected property, well, we know that we should change the isSelected. So hopefully nothing new in here. Now that we know the actual value, the current value of the isSelected, let's evaluate if this is true. So if isSelected is true, what I want to do is set the background color of our cell to something different. So let's start very easy to just setting the background color to some gray color. So notice that the cell, which again we already have from the getCellCore, has a set background color method. And this method is going to require a color, which we can create through the color class. And we can actually create it from hexadecimal or RGB. We have seen this before. Let's create one from a hexadecimal value. And I have a grayish color in here. So let's just use E6, E6, which is sort of gray. And I'm going to cast it as an Android variable. So basically just whenever this is selected, the background is going to be gray instead of the default of all orange. And if this is not, this means that this was previously true and now it is no longer selected. Well, I also want to change the background, but I am going to do it differently. Instead of setting it to a hexadecimal value that I don't really have, I am going to set it to the default background. So you may have guessed it, but if you didn't, maybe it is now clearer what I meant when I created this default background variable. Basically, at the beginning, when the cell is not selected, which is the default state of any cell, not selected at the beginning, it has a certain background, and I'm just going to hold to that background over in this variable. So whenever that cell is no longer selected, well, I am going to set its background back to the default background. So to make things a little bit clearer, let me just go ahead and guide you through what is going to happen. So the first time that we create a cell, the getCellCore is going to be called. Of course, because the custom view cell renderer is going to be used. And of course, the first time any cell is created, it is not selected, which is why I'm setting this to false, and it has a default background, which I am just going to get into this variable. However, when one of its property changes, this method is going to be called, and I am going to evaluate if the property that changed is the selected. If it happens to be this property, I will change what the selected variable is to its opposite. So the first time this changes, it means that it goes from false over to true. And that means that I'm going to set the background to gray. The next time it changes though, this is going to be true and I'm going to change it over to false. This means that the cell has been deselected. And so I am going to set its background back to the default background. As you can see, this is actually quite straightforward. If we now test this out, again, remember that this is only going to be applied to the view cell renderers. We are going to see that now the background color is going to be this grayish color instead of the awful orange that was there by default. So now if the application runs again here in just a couple of seconds and we list all of the categories like we see in here, and we select one of these elements, now we see that the background is gray instead of that awful orange. And notice that if I select another one, this one changes back to its default background because it is no longer selected. So there you have it. This is everything that you need to do. So there you have it. Just another quick example of what you can achieve with custom renderers. Now in the next section, like I mentioned previously, we're finally going to take a look at dependency services, one of the most useful features in the world of Xamarin Forms development.